A young girl's tragedy, a cold case reopened, and a long dead criminal. Today's video is about the gruesome rape and murder of Sharron Prior, a bright and friendly 16-year-old from Montreal's Point St. Charles neighborhood. Her abduction and murder case was initially declared cold, but 48 years later, it was unearthed and solved through the miracle of science. The date was March 29, 1975. It is a chilly Saturday night, and Sharron and her friends decide to meet up for pizza. What starts as a harmless girls' night out would turn into one of Quebec's most high-profile serial killer cases. Sharron leaves her house for the pizza parlor where her friends await her, an outing that isn't new to her or others in her circles. However, despite being in a safe city and on a familiar route, Sharron would never make it to her friends. Instead, a heartbreaking fate awaited the young girl. 3 days later, Quebec police discovered a dead body ditched alongside the road in the snow in Longueuil, rural Quebec. Investigations begin, but more questions are asked than answered. How did her night go from a casual night out with friends to a deadly and brutal fate? And what kept this case from being solved all these years? Keep watching to find out the mysterious murder that chilled Montreal for decades and the miraculous discovery that would heat up this cold case and bring closure to Sharron's family. On April 1st, the police found Sharron's body dumped in the snow about 15 miles from where they suspected she got kidnapped. It had clear signs of sexual assault and struggle. The haphazard crime scene spoke volumes of the torture she had endured that night. The assaulter had removed her pants and restrained her hands with tape. Her underwear was found on a nearby tree. In her lifeless hand, Sharron held a tree branch. It was a clear sign of resistance. In her futile attempts to fight off the abductor, Sharron had used whatever she could get her hands on, but eventually she failed and lost her life. Given the nature of the case, an autopsy of the body was conducted. The medical examiners concluded Sharron had been suffocated and beaten before she died. The next piece in the story was traces of blood samples found at the murder site. However, it was still 1975. Without larger amounts of blood, the forensic capabilities weren't powerful enough to prove useful. Hundreds of investigations would unfold, from potential enemies of the victim to local townies, but none would bring the Quebec police any closer to the murderer, and the case would turn cold for years. So, who was the vicious culprit? Was it a stalker who had been on Sharron's tail for a while, or someone who had taken advantage of the poor girl? Stick around as we pick apart the horrors of that chilly March night and find out. May 2023, hundreds of miles away, and 48 years later, Mark Sorcia, prosecuting attorney of Putnam County, West Virginia, gets a call from Canadian cold case detectives. What they would have to say would leave Sorcia shocked. It was time to reopen Sharron Prior's case and bring her justice thanks to science and all new medical technology. In the early 1980s, there came a Nobel Prize-winning breakthrough in the field of chemistry, the polymerase chain reaction, or PCR for short. It was a technique discovered by Dr. Kary Mullis to amplify even trace samples of DNA into billion-fold copies in a matter of hours. This would have far-reaching consequences in many realms of science, from the dusty works of carbon dating fossils to following the bloody trails of forensics. One high-profile case you may be familiar with is the O.J. Simpson case. Dr. Kary Mullis himself was called to testify on the forensic studies trying to connect O.J. to the murder. Developments through the next few decades will see more and more applications of PCR in aiding the police in criminal investigations. One of these would be Sharron Prior's investigation. Fast forward to 2023, and Canadian detectives dig up well-preserved blood samples from Sharron's murder site. By developing sophisticated PCR techniques, they are able to find DNA matches for brothers from West Virginia. The detectives tell Sorcia that they know with 100% certainty that the brother who committed the rape and brutal murder of Sharron Prior is in fact Franklin Maywood Romine. The Canadian detectives must have had some reason to run PCR of the blood samples against Franklin Romine. So, how were they able to connect this West Virginia family to a murder hundreds of miles away? Stay tuned to find out. Franklin Romine was born in 1946 in Huntington, West Virginia. He would be 30 around the time he would have killed Sharron. It turns out Sharron was not Romine's first victim. In fact, their paths had collided while Romine was on the run for a previous crime, the rape of his love interest, a waitress from Parkersburg. Romine had escaped the West Virginia police and made a run for it in Montreal. On February 6, 1976, Romine would be captured by Quebec police in Montreal. Eventually, his case was extradited to the US, and Romine was sent back to West Virginia. The second crucial piece, in addition to the blood samples, was the rape of the waitress. The case would help Canadian scientists 50 years later in linking Romine from the West Virginia. That case would help Canadian scientists 50 years later in linking Romine from West Virginia to Sharron of Canada. February 1974, Bob Newell, a young patrolman in Parkersburg, West Virginia, gets a call from the city's south side reporting an incident of sexual assault. He goes to the call site and finds a break-in situation. There's broken glass all over the floor, and a 23-year-old woman is present in extreme distress. She tells Newell that Romine had broken into her apartment in the middle of the night while she slept and threw a $20 bill at her before leaving. What was worse was that her 4-year-old was crying in the room next door the whole time. On further investigation, she informed the authorities that she knew Romine from her job as a waitress when he would frequently come in for coffee. Over time, Romine developed a liking for the waitress, and on one of his coffee visits, he even tried asking her out. However, what started out as harmless flirting for Romine soon became a maddening obsession. In the jury trials that would follow, the victim recounts, "He said he had wanted me from the first time he ever saw me, and that he was going to have me even if he had to kill me." Despite the difficulties for women fighting rape cases in the 70s, the jury sided with the waitress and found Romine guilty, the first conviction on charges of rape in the county in nearly a decade. But it wouldn't be the last one for Romine. The jury also suggested a mercy deal for Romine. However, by the time the trial was executed, it was already 1976. Sharron had already become Romine's next prey. Officer Newell's take on the matter was that Romine was simply a sociopath. He says, "Knowing what we know now about Romine, he was probably obviously a sociopath all along. It wasn't anything he learned. You don't learn that. He's a typical example of that." In the months Romine was on the run, he had made several rounds back and forth between Montreal and West Virginia, and in one of such rounds, he had gotten his hands on young Sharron. The lead investigator from Longueuil, police detective Sergeant Eric Ratsikoton, also described Romine's mindset and movements as a game of catch me if you can. Despite his back and forth between the two countries, Romine would be found mysteriously dead at the age of 36 in Verdun, Montreal. His body would make one final trip back to West Virginia, where it would be buried, but not for good. They say justice is best served cold, but in the case of the Prior family, they didn't have a choice in the matter. They had to wait half a century to avenge their beloved Sharron. After Mark Sorcia received a call from the Canadian detectives, Franklin Romine's body was exhumed, the crime confirmed, and the case declared closed at last. When the news broke to the long grieving family of the victim, they had a somber celebration of justice for the Sharron Prior, who would have been 64 today. In a press conference days after, Sharron's sisters, Maureen and Doreen Prior, plus their aging mother, Yvonne Prior, reflected on the conviction of a dead Franklin Romine. "You may never have come back to our house or Congregation Street that weekend, but you have never left our hearts, and you never will," Sharron's sister Maureen said. The solving of Sharron's case will never bring Sharron back, but knowing that her killer is no longer on this earth and won't kill anymore brings us to somewhat of a closure, Prior's sister Doreen said. "We love you, Sharron. Now you may truly rest in peace," her sister said as they finally closed the horrific chapter of Sharron's rape and murder. They thanked the miracle of science that allowed them to find some semblance of redemption for their long-lost sister. In the end, this was a story of justice served, better late than never, a story of losing a child and slowly losing hope for justice over 5 decades, and ultimately a story of closure. Share this story with your friends, ask them to put themselves in Sharron's family's shoes, and think about what closure must feel like for a family that endured the worst. If you want to learn more about stories like Sharron's, drop a like and subscribe to the channel. And remember, stay safe out there.